Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a moment in history that is so critical, yet, often forgotten or just obscured, that it truly defines modern geopolitical tensions.
I think that's a perfect way to put it.
We're talking about the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, known to the intelligence community by its codename, Operation TPAJX.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you really want to understand the roots of the tumultuous relationship between the United States and Iran,
Right.
the anti-American sentiment that fueled the 1979 revolution, and that deep, deep historical mistrust that still shadows negotiations today over sanctions and nuclear development, you have to start right here.
This was the moment.
This was the pivotal moment. It's a textbook example of unintended consequences where a popularly supported, democratically elected government was overthrown by a joint intelligence operation.
Orchestrated by the U.S. and the U.K.
Exactly.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward, but it's demanding, which is perfect for a deep dive like this. We need to thoroughly analyze the complex timeline of this event and really identify the economic imperatives, the cynical Cold War calculations, and the precise and often surprising political and financial factors that drove the entire plot.
And then connect that shockwave directly to the geopolitical realities we're all facing today.
Precisely.
The central and I think painful question we have to answer, using the declassified records and historical accounts that are now available to us, is deceptively simple.
And what is that question?
How did Mohammad Mosaddegh, a man who was a national hero, a champion of Iranian sovereignty and constitutional rule, how did he fall from power?
And what's the irrefutable evidence that confirms this foreign intervention by the CIA and MI6? The intervention that, was denied for decades.
For decades. We're effectively peeling back the layers on what some people have called the original sin of U.S.-Iran relations.
That denial is maybe the most audacious part of the whole story. For years, this was treated as, conspiracy theory by official sources.
Oh, absolutely.
But to really get a grip on the tension that led to this overthrow, we first have to rewind. We have to set the scene for Iran's really centuries-long struggle for sovereignty against outside powers.
To set the context, you have to establish that 1953 was not some isolated incident. Foreign control in Iran had deep, entrenched roots going back well into the 19th century.
And the British in particular.
The British especially. They had a long history of intervening in Persian domestic affairs. Famously, they opposed the Persian Constitutional Revolution of 1906.
And that 1906 constitution is itself a key piece of this puzzle because it really reveals that tension between the people and the crown. It was an interesting, incomplete democratic step.
Very incomplete. It established a parliament, the Majlis, but it was, as you say, a half measure. It still left the Shah with significant executive powers.
It wasn't just a figurehead.
Not at all. The Constitution got rid of arbitrary rule, but the Shah was still very much an executive. He could issue royal decrees, he could dismiss the Prime Minister. He even had a say in the Senate, though the Senate wasn't fully convened until 1949.
So the constant struggle in Iranian politics was whether the Shah would rule or simply reign.
That's the perfect summary. And the British had a history of trying to crush even that fragile democracy. They even backed a Shah who tried to break up the democratic government by force until he was eventually deposed.
So fast forward to the 1940s, and you can imagine Iranians were just intensely sensitive to any external power manipulating their internal politics.
Especially when it came to their resources.
Which brings us to the central prize of the region, oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, which is now part of BP,
Right.
was the dominant British corporation that had discovered and then controlled Iran's vast oil reserves through a notoriously lopsided deal that was granted decades earlier.
And when you say notoriously lopsided, we're talking staggeringly unfair by any modern standard.
I mean, the sources describe how, despite operating the largest oil refinery in the world at Abadan, Iran received this ridiculously small percentage of the profits.
The Standard Agreement basically gave Britain the resources of an entire nation for a pittance. And the AIOC employees lived in these comfortable, segregated compounds, acting like a colonial power on Iranian soil.
It's no surprise that by the late 1940s, popular discontent over the AIOC was absolutely reaching a boiling point.
The outrage wasn't just among intellectuals, it was national. A huge segment of the Iranian public, and many key politicians, saw the company as openly exploitative. They saw it as a central tool of what they called continued British imperialism in Iran.
The consensus was that this whole arrangement was just keeping Iran weak, undermining the material and economic conditions of the entire population.
And this deep nationwide discontent is the perfect political landscape for the rise of a figure like Mohammad Mosaddegh.
His political movement wasn't just about oil, though. It was also rooted in challenging the monarchy itself, specifically the increasing executive power of the Shah.
That context is vital. The incumbent Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had started taking a much more active political role after someone tried to assassinate him in 1949.
He used that instability to consolidate power.
Exactly. He amended the constitution and formally established the Senate.
And Mosaddegh saw this increase in the Shah's power as profoundly undemocratic. He believed it contradicted the whole spirit of the 1906 Constitution.
He famously championed the idea that the Shah should reign, but not rule.
Like a European constitutional monarch.
Precisely, where the real executive power rests with the elected prime minister and the Majlis. He became the de facto leader of this large, diverse coalition of political parties called the National Front.
And their major policy goal was unmistakable. It was straightforward, and it resonated with just about every citizen.
Comprehensive oil nationalization. Mossadegh essentially became the face of Iranian anti-colonial defiance and, true democratic governance.
So the fuse was ultimately lit in 1951. And it wasn't with a direct confrontation, but with a request for basic accountability.
That's right. Mosaddegh, newly empowered, started efforts to audit the AIOC's documents. He just wanted to verify that the company was paying Iran the royalties it was supposed to, citing concerns over how the profit split was calculated.
And the AIOC, operating with this imperial confidence, just outright refused to cooperate.
Yes, refused. That was a monumental strategic error by the British, when the AIOC stonewalled and basically claimed that the complex accounting of profits was none of the Iranian government's business.
The parliament, the Majlis, responded.
And they responded decisively. In March 1951, they voted, nearly unanimously, to nationalize Iran's oil industry and to immediately expel all foreign corporate representatives from the country.
That must have been an absolutely euphoric moment for the National Front and for the public, the ultimate act of sovereignty.
It was. The sources described the bill as being wildly popular among Iranians, generating a huge wave of nationalism. This decision instantly cemented Mosaddegh as a national hero and immediately placed Iran at the center of worldwide attention.
It was a direct, successful, and hugely symbolic act of defiance against a major global imperial power.
And an alarm bell for every Western oil company worldwide.
So now that Iran had seized control of its own oil, Britain had to react. And their reaction was immediate, comprehensive, and, ultimately devastating.
What followed was an act of brutal economic warfare, famously known as the Abadan crisis.
And the UK strategy was simple, if brutal?
It was. They decided to financially starve Iran into submission. They instigated a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil, threatening legal action against any country or company that tried to purchase it.
And our sources confirm this boycott was just devastatingly effective. It financially crippled Iran's economy within months.
We're talking about more than just lost revenue. The British didn't just shut down the flow of oil, they withdrew their experts, their technical staff.
And they took legal action everywhere to block Iranian oil sales.
They effectively froze the country out of international markets. The Abadan refinery, the largest in the world at the time, and the jewel of AIOC's operations, just ground to a halt.
And Iran, which relied almost exclusively on oil revenue for its national budget, saw its income just plummet.
From about $50 million a year to almost nothing. The economic situation deteriorated rapidly. You had inflation, rising unemployment, and this immense financial strain that started to fracture Mossadegh's fragile political coalition.
Britain even considered a direct military response at first, right? Mobilizing forces to physically seize control of Abadan.
Yes, but Prime Minister Clement Attlee opted instead to rely primarily on the crushing economic boycott. He was worried, that a military invasion would be condemned globally and might push Iran irrevocably toward the Soviet orbit.
But even while the boycott was tightening, they were already working behind the scenes.
Oh, absolutely. The British government was already actively employing covert agents and funds to undermine Mossadegh's government from within, using that financial strain to amplify domestic opposition.
And yet, despite the boycott and the internal sabotage, Mosaddegh somehow managed to keep the country afloat, at least for a while.
Yeah.
He wasn't completely defeated.
He used some extraordinary countermeasures. He relied on Iran's large agricultural base and its limited reliance on imports for manufacturing to survive. His government boosted non-oil exports, got more rigorous with customs duties, and sold government bonds to patriotic citizens.
But the reality was the country was just limping along.
He knew he couldn't survive indefinitely.
And it's so crucial to note here that Mossadegh was actually ready to compromise, at least on the economics, if not the principle of national ownership.
Absolutely. To resolve the crisis, he proposed splitting the oil profits 50-50 between Iran and Britain. This wasn't some radical idea he just pulled out of thin air.
No, it was based on an existing successful arrangement.
The 1948 compromise between the Venezuelan government and Creole Petroleum, which had stabilized that whole region.
That seems entirely reasonable. I mean, it's a way for Britain to save face and still secure half the oil flow. But Britain refused.
They refused completely, even against the recommendation of the United States at the time.
Why? Why the complete intransigence? Was it purely about the money, or was it something deeper?
It was fundamentally about the imperial principle. Britain, now under Churchill again, viewed Mossadegh's nationalization as a catastrophic precedent.
A precedent that could lead to the collapse of all its colonial holdings and concessions worldwide.
Exactly. Accepting a 50-50 deal after nationalization would imply that any colonial power could be forced to the table just by having its assets seized. The UK believed that Mossadegh had to fail, spectacularly and completely, no matter the cost.
This stalemate perfectly sets the stage for the dramatic shift in American policy. Initially, the Truman administration actually opposed the idea of a coup. Why was that?
Well, Truman's administration was worried about the long-term geopolitical fallout. They were wary of setting a precedent for the CIA to be involved in overthrowing a foreign, democratically elected leader.
They were worried about the moral and legal implications.
And the potential anti-American backlash. They even considered giving economic assistance to Mossadegh as late as 1952, hoping to stabilize his government and keep Iran out of Soviet hands without, resorting to covert action.
But then the geopolitical temperature changed dramatically with the transition to the Eisenhower administration in early 1953, and this is where the British played their ultimate diplomatic hand.
Indeed. British intelligence officials, notably Christopher Steele and later the MI6 agent Robin Zahner, were absolutely instrumental in initiating and planning the coup.
They convinced the U.S. that Mossadegh was unamenable
To reason. And crucially, they started playing heavily on the U.S. fear of the growing influence of the Communist Tudeh party in Tehran.
So the oil dispute, which was fundamentally about Iranian nationalism and ownership, gets cynically reframed as a Cold War imperative.
Exactly right. The new U.S. leadership, particularly the Dulles brothers, saw the world in starkly black and white anti-communist terms. You had John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and his brother Allen Dulles as the director of the CIA.
A powerful ideological duo that fundamentally reshaped American foreign policy toward aggressive covert action.
They were zealous in defending American capitalism. Mossadegh's success in nationalization was seen not just as a problem for Britain, but as a dangerous threat to U.S. global interests.
If Iran can nationalize its oil, what would stop Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or Indonesia?
That's the core insight. For the Dulles brothers, the primary fear wasn't necessarily a Soviet invasion, but the success of resource nationalism leading to a domino effect that could endanger all Western oil concessions globally.
So they linked Iranian nationalism directly to the Soviet threat,
arguing that a chaotic, bankrupt Iran under Mossadegh was just ripe for a Tudeh takeover.
It's fascinating how effective the British were at leveraging U.S. Cold War paranoia. They essentially persuaded the superpower that helping Britain regain control of its oil was actually an essential step in preventing Soviet global domination.
And there's that anecdote about the American diplomat Averell Harriman visiting Tehran. It just captures the impossibility of compromise perfectly.
This was in 1951.
Yes, he visited hoping to mediate. He met the Shah, who admitted he couldn't say a single word against nationalization because public opinion was so massive. Then Harriman holds a press conference calling for reason.
And it backfires.
Spectacularly. A journalist stands up, shouts support for Mossadegh, and the entire room just erupts in cheers. They all march out, celebrating nationalization, leaving the American diplomat completely dismayed.
That massive, uncompromising wave of nationalism was what ultimately terrified Washington and London.
It was.
So the high-level decision is made.
Yeah.
A democratically elected leader must fall to protect Western oil interests framed under the banner of anti-communism.
Now we move from the geopolitics to the dirty mechanics on the ground.
Operation TPAJX.
The TP was the CIA country prefix for Iran, and AJX being the popular household cleanser. It is, as you said before, a chillingly prosaic code name.
It really revealed the plotters' mindset. They saw this as a cleanup job, an aggressive scouring of what they considered a communist-leaning infection in the Middle East. And the chief CIA operative on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt Jr.
Grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, tasked with running the entire operation. This was a true joint effort, though MI6, which had been plotting against Mosaddegh for years, had to accept a kind of junior position.
And the financial engine behind this was just immense for the time.
Astronomical. Robin Zahner, the MI6 agent who was critical to the early planning, was tasked with securing Mossadegh's overthrow. Historical accounts describe him literally using a humble biscuit tin to dole out over £1.5 million.
That's an astronomical sum in the early 1950s.
Tens of millions of dollars today, used purely to buy influence, propaganda, and bodies on the street.
And the central, absolute hurdle for the plotters wasn't the money. It was securing the Shah's cooperation.
That was the key. The plan required him to constitutionally dismiss Mossadegh by signing royal decrees or firmans and appointing their chosen replacement, General Fazlollah Zahedi.
But the Shah was indecisive, weak, and frankly terrified of the popular backlash.
He was. So the conspirators needed ironclad proof that this operation had official backing from the highest levels of the U.S. and U.K. governments to convince the hesitant Shah to sign his name.
And this led to that famous, almost cinematic detail.
Churchill himself, who was vehemently anti-Mossadegh, arranged for the BBC Persian radio to broadcast a specific code word. The BBC was supposedly this neutral, reliable source of international news.
But to reassure the Shah that the operation was officially supported.
Instead of the usual simple time announcement, the BBC presenter said, "It is now exactly midnight." That single emphasized word was the signal.
That is just an astonishing breach of trust for a major global broadcaster. It must have confirmed for many Iranians that the British were absolutely working against their government.
It was a profound betrayal, and once that high-level commitment was secured, the operation launched a massive, coordinated psychological warfare campaign.
Using the press, handbills, and the Tehran clergy to weaken the Mossadegh government.
And this propaganda wasn't subtle.
Not at all.
They published hundreds of false articles in the press, accusing Mossadegh of being a communist dupe, a closet homosexual, or even a foreign agent, capitalizing on the intense social and religious conservatism of the time.
And the BBC Persian radio, having established itself as a propaganda arm, was so blatant in its shift that its own Iranian staff went on strike.
They did, and on the streets, they were actively distributing anti-Mossadegh handbills, creating this constant sense of chaos and government incompetence.
And beyond media manipulation, the operation used brute force and bribery.
Yes. The CIA's ground teams hired some of the most feared mobsters in Tehran, including notorious figures like Shaban Jafari, known as Brainless Shaban, to stage coordinated pro-Shah riots.
They literally abused other paid men, often poor laborers and marginalized individuals, to take over key streets.
They were organizing the anti-nationalist movement's street-fighting wing, even forging links with neo-Nazi groups and Islamic fundamentalists to make sure the street violence appeared widespread and, grassroots.
We also have to look at the political fragmentation within Mossadegh's supposedly solid National Front base. Specifically, the critical role of the clergy.
This was perhaps the decisive domestic factor. Mossadegh's main clerical supporter, the hugely influential Ayatollah Kashani, turned against him.
And this wasn't just ideological, it was political.
It was. Mossadegh was squeezing him out of power, trying to enforce secular governmental control, which deprived the prime minister of essential religious support at a crucial time.
So the CIA exploited this existing political rift.
Precisely. Other conservative clerics, like Ayatollah Behbahani, were mobilized and documented by sources as receiving funds from the CIA. Behbahani's mob was instrumental. The move by a significant portion of the religious establishment to oppose Mossadegh was really seen as the final, decisive domestic factor in his downfall.
It shattered that narrative of unified national support.
Completely.
So the coup itself was this chaotic 4-day sequence, and it started with an apparent failure that must have caused absolute panic in Washington and London.
It did. On August 15th, the Shah finally signed the firmans dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Zahedi. Colonel Nematollah Nasiri, the commander of the Imperial Guard, delivered the decree.
But Mossadegh had been warned.
He had, likely by agents within the Tudeh party, who were monitoring the plotters closely. He rejected the firman, arguing that under the Constitution, the Shah had no right to dismiss an elected prime minister without parliament's consent.
So he seized the momentum.
He had the messenger, Colonel Nasseri, arrested, and nationalist units seized key points in Tehran. The first attempt was thoroughly defeated. Pro-Mossadegh crowds gathered, celebrating in Parliament Square, assuming the monarchists had failed.
A total disaster for TP Ajax. The situation seemed so lost that the Shah...
He immediately fled the country, accompanied by Queen Soraya. He traveled first to Baghdad and then flew to Rome. The CIA operation appeared completely finished.
Kermit Roosevelt reportedly sent a desperate, almost defeated message back to Washington.
And a U.S. official declared an utter defeat. We now have to take a whole new look at the Iranian situation and probably have to snuggle up to Mossadegh.
But the CIA did not give up. They launched what became known as the successful counter-coup on August 19th. What was the critical pivot point that allowed them to reverse this catastrophic failure?
The persistence of the CIA operative on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt, combined with the continuous influx of money to mobilize the mobs.
Right.
Despite Mossadegh issuing a decree banning demonstrations on that day, hoping to calm the unrest, Roosevelt doubled down. He funneled more money, mobilizing the paid crowds and using the various right-wing and neo-Nazi street groups they had previously subsidized.
And chaos was the key ingredient, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Bloody street battles broke out, and while the CIA-backed mobs were the primary instigators, the Communist Tudeh Party activists also took to the streets.
And the Tudeh were anti-Shah, but also profoundly antagonistic toward Mosaddegh.
They saw him as a bourgeois nationalist, so their presence, fighting the right-wing groups, just added to the sense of total governmental collapse and created the perfect cover for the army to intervene.
It sounds like pure, manufactured, and deliberately intensified chaos designed to create a sense of inevitable collapse, justifying military intervention.
That was the strategic goal. By midday, large crowds, now including thousands of ordinary citizens who were anti-Tudeh or just looking for stability, began gathering in support of the returning Shah.
And under General Zahidi's authority, the army left its barracks.
They drove off the Tudeh and nationalist forces and violently stormed government buildings, including Tehran Radio.
And the final, dramatic moment of Mossadegh's fall.
It was violent. Mossadegh fled his residence after a tank fired a shell right into his house, rather than organizing a desperate last stand that would have resulted in an untold number of civilian deaths.
He turned himself in.
He did, ensuring a relatively quick end to the violence. By the close of August 19th, General Zahedi and the military were firmly in control of the government, and the coup was complete.
So the chaotic counter-coup succeeded, resulting in the violent overthrow of Iran's first genuinely democratic government. We know that between 200 and 300 people were killed in the fighting. What was the immediate shift in governance?
Well, General Zahedi formed a new military-backed government. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was able to return from Rome and rule more firmly as monarch for the next 26 years.
And critically, he returned not as a constitutional figure, but as an absolute ruler who relied heavily on United States support, arms, and training to hold on to power.
Effectively turning Iran into a deeply authoritarian client state.
This transition was a direct abandonment of the principles Mossadegh fought for.
It was a total reversal. The Shah's first act to secure his power was to suppress all forms of political opposition. This included establishing the notorious Internal Security and Intelligence Service, SAVAK.
Which was initially trained by U.S. and Israeli intelligence experts.
Yes, and SAVAK became this feared instrument of internal repression, using torture, imprisonment, and execution to silence dissent against the Pahlavi regime.
The fate of the nationalist hero, Mosaddegh, was tragically predictable.
It was a clear, brutal warning to anyone who dared champion resource nationalization and democracy against Western interests. Mosaddegh was arrested, tried, and convicted of treason by the Shah's military court.
The sentence:
3 years in solitary confinement, followed by house arrest for the rest of his life until his death in 1967. Other Mossadegh supporters were imprisoned, many were executed, crushing the backbone of the National Front.
And the ultimate motive for the U.S. and U.K. immediately became clear in the commercial aftermath, proving that oil was the central focus, not just fighting communism.
Absolutely. The Shah immediately rewarded the American intervention by dismantling the Nationalization Act. Instead of fully restoring the AIOC's previous concession, which would have been politically impossible.
They formed a new international oil consortium in 1954.
Exactly. And the structure of this consortium was a deliberate geopolitical arrangement. Britain received 40% of the oil fields, fulfilling their demand for partial restoration,
But the American companies were granted a significant 40% stake.
with the remaining 20% divided among other Western partners like Shell and CFP. This proved unequivocally that U.S. international oil interests were among the direct beneficiaries of the whole thing.
So the U.S. not only helped overthrow democracy, but used the coup to gain a massive foothold in Iranian oil, fundamentally altering the global distribution of oil power.
The core drive for the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower was preventing Mosaddegh from succeeding in achieving real nationalization, because that success was perceived as a threat to U.S. oil interests throughout the world.
Resource security first, ideological battle second.
Right. And this successful coup also set an infamous, deadly precedent for intervention in the Middle East and, well, globally.
It became one of the first successful uses of covert operations by the U.S. to overthrow a foreign government.
And the first American intervention of this nature in the Middle East. And established a blueprint for United States involvement in regime change that was replicated throughout the Cold War era.
And you can trace that blueprint globally. It's easy to connect the tactics used in Ajax to later interventions, like the 1964 Brazilian coup d'etat and the 1973 Chilean coup against Salvador Allende.
The 1953 operation was a foundational template. Combine economic warfare with sophisticated propaganda, secure the cooperation of local military elements, and use paid street mobs to simulate a popular uprising.
The Shah's rule, relying so heavily on American support for the next 26 years, it seemed stable in the short term.
But that stability was purchased at the expense of democracy and human rights.
And this, ultimately, is the groundwork for the 1979 Iranian Revolution. By crushing the secular democratic option in 1953, the U.S. guaranteed that the inevitable popular uprising that eventually came would be far more radical and authoritarian.
The coup cemented an authoritarian regime, repressed secular democratic movements, and planted those deep seeds of anti-American sentiment that culminated in the 1979 revolution.
There's that stark quote from Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, who visited Iran before and after the coup.
When Mosaddegh and Persia started basic reforms, we became alarmed. We united with the British to destroy him. We succeeded. And ever since, our name has not been an honored one in the Middle East.
It's remarkable that despite the gravity of this event, decades passed before the U.S. officially acknowledged its role. It was a long, painful road to admission.
The official history was actively scrubbed. For decades, the U.S. government avoided declassifying crucial details and was even documented destroying operational records.
The scale of the deceit was breathtaking. A 1989 State Department volume on the era, which was supposed to be the official record, made not a single reference to U.S. or British covert actions.
That omission wasn't just careless. It was so severe it led to the resignation of the chief outside advisor on the historical series, who called it an unforgivable act of historical falsification.
So this internal pressure, combined with relentless lobbying from historians and Congress, finally forced the government's hand.
It did, and the official confirmation was drawn out over the 2000s, finally acknowledging the undeniable truth.
In 2000, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was one of the first high-ranking officials to publicly acknowledge the coup's pivotal role.
She stated that the Eisenhower administration believed its actions were justified for strategic reasons, but the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development, and it is easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention.
Sources noted she came closer to apologizing than any American official had before.
And then in 2009, President Barack Obama explicitly spoke about the U.S. role in his Cairo speech, saying, "In the middle of the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government."
The CIA finally confirmed its role in declassified documents in the 2010s, publishing records that explicitly detailed the payments and propaganda campaigns run by Kermit Roosevelt.
And what remains an interesting, almost stubborn contrast is the reaction of the UK.
Right.
The British government, by contrast, continues to deny researchers access to crucial documents concerning the coup. So while the U.S. has admitted its culpability, the U.K. still maintains this thick veil of secrecy over its involvement.
It highlights the persistent difference in how the two former allies approach their imperial history. Despite the efforts by both the Shah's monarchist revisionists and the current Islamic Republic to downplay or distort his achievements, Mossadegh remains an incredibly potent and unifying icon in Iran today.
He is the ultimate symbol of anti-colonial nationalism and secular constitutionalism. Had he been allowed to remain in office, he would have been a natural leader of the nascent non-aligned movement.
Which was founded in 1961 by giants like Nehru and Nasser.
Exactly. And to this day, his fragile democratic experience remains a beacon of hope and a vital reference point for Iranian democracy movements of all stripes.
It's a testament to his legacy that he galvanizes support across the spectrum in Iran, standing against the two main historical narratives, those who want to restore the Pahlavi dynasty and those who run the Islamic Republic.
Well, the Islamic Republic often praises Mossadegh's nationalization efforts, but minimizes or entirely ignores his secular democratic vision in order to justify its own authoritarian religious reign.
And this isn't just history for history's sake. This story directly influences modern geopolitics, particularly concerning sanctions, leverage, and the ongoing nuclear negotiations.
It serves as a crucial, painful, cautionary tale for current policymakers.
How so? What specific actionable lessons should policymakers draw from the oil nationalization crisis when dealing with, say, the current nuclear impasse?
Well, the 1951-53 oil embargo was undeniably devastatingly effective in terms of crippling Iran's national finances and causing immense hardship. But even that severe economic crisis could not force a quick repudiation of a policy nationalization that most Iranians and Mossadegh's government saw as essential to their sovereignty and national security.
The lesson there is profound. The financial pain didn't break the political will.
Exactly. The crisis suggests that misinterpreting the adversary's leverage, approaching negotiations in zero-sum terms, and believing that economic crisis alone can force a quick change in a policy perceived as existential like, today, the nuclear program.
It leads to disastrous results.
It does. Policymakers of 1953 believed financial collapse would force Mossadegh to yield control, but it didn't. It just radicalized him further and fueled nationalist outrage.
And that misreading led to the coup, which was the ultimate short-term win and a long-term disaster for Western interests.
The ultimate lesson is the blowback. Intervention in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation, regardless of the immediate policy goal, can lead to unpredictable consequences and severe blowback.
By crushing the secular democratic option in 1953, the U.S. guaranteed that future backlash would come from the religious, anti-Western hardliners.
Which is exactly what happened leading up to 1979. Critics today argue that aggressive, non-negotiating sanctions policy similarly risks weakening Iran's already fragile civil society and inadvertently empowering the hardest of hardliners, setting the stage for future radicalization.
This deep dive into Operation Ajax confirms that 1953 was not simply a Cold War maneuver to halt communism, although that was the convenient justification used to gain U.S. buy-in.
It wasn't.
It was fundamentally about controlling oil, preventing a global trend toward resource nationalization, and defending Western corporate interests. This clash between national sovereignty and foreign economic interests fundamentally altered Iranian destiny and paved the path to the current deeply fraught and highly volatile relationship.
And looking back, you see Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader, brought down because he drew an unwavering line. He refused any compromise that allowed a degree of foreign control over Iran's most vital resource.
His commitment to principle cost him his power and his freedom.
And yet, his successor, the pro-Western Shah, immediately turned around and granted U.S. and British oil interests a 95% concession stake in Iran's oil fields. It confirms that the coup resolved the economic conflict decisively in favor of foreign powers.
Which raises a crucial question for you to consider, drawing on the sources we've examined. When a nation seeks control over its own resources and foreign intervention succeeds in reversing that national policy, does that intervention ever truly stabilize a region? Or does it merely delay conflict and guarantee a deeper, more radicalized backlash later on, ensuring the original wound of national humiliation is never truly healed?